What began as a regal evening of unity soon spiraled into silent stares and a chilling confrontation. As Queen Camilla reached for a tiara steeped in Diana's legacy, Prince William's quiet yet devastating move stopped everything, shattering decades of fragile peace within the palace. The Windsor banquet had been planned with the precision that only a royal court could execute, an opulent gathering intended to symbolize strength, stability, and togetherness in front of the world. Dignitaries from France, ambassadors from across Europe, and members of the Commonwealth all arrived expecting grace and grandeur. But behind the palace doors, turmoil simmered. Among the many royal jewels to be worn that evening, one piece had been requested in private: the sapphire and diamond tiara, once famously worn by Princess Diana. The request came not from Catherine, the Princess of Wales, but from Camilla, the Queen Consort. The news traveled quickly within the palace. When Camilla made her intentions known, a chill reportedly ran through the corridors. The sapphire tiara had not graced a royal head since Diana's passing. To many, it wasn't just a crown, it was a symbol of pain, of betrayal, of a mother lost too soon. It belonged in spirit, if not in law, to William and Harry. And while Harry had chosen to distance himself from royal affairs, William had never forgotten the silent pact he made long ago. Camilla's decision to wear the tiara on such a visible, public night was not only bold but, in William's eyes, unforgivable. According to palace sources, the moment William was informed of Camilla's intent, everything changed. There was no formal declaration, no grand confrontation. Instead, he acted swiftly and quietly. Aides were dispatched to Camilla's chambers just as she was finalizing her preparations. There was no room for debate. The message was clear: she would not wear the tiara. Not tonight. Not ever. What followed was a flurry of confusion behind closed doors. Camilla's team scrambled for alternatives, while the Queen Consort herself reportedly stood motionless, staring at the empty tiara box. The air was thick with tension. Charles, informed but restrained, remained silent. The sovereign did not intervene, choosing instead to let his son's word stand. When the banquet began, every camera caught the detail. Camilla arrived wearing a modest tiara from the royal collection, not the one that carried Diana's memory. Observers noticed the shift instantly. The smile she wore seemed tighter than usual, her gaze unfocused. Within hours, speculation had begun. Whispers turned into headlines. Queen Camilla snubbed? Where was Diana's tiara? The press feasted on the drama, but the true story was darker, more personal. This wasn't about jewelry. It never had been. The tiara was a symbol of power, of remembrance, of identity. And in that moment, stripped of it, Camilla felt exposed. William hadn't just made a royal decision. He had sent a message publicly and permanently. A reckoning had begun, and Camilla was now its first casualty. But to understand why this single moment shattered Camilla, we must go back to the painful origins of the crown that never truly belonged to her. No jewel in the royal vault holds more pain or power than the tiara once worn by the people's princess. Among the countless treasures that sat in velvet boxes beneath Buckingham Palace, none carried the weight of sorrow and memory quite like the sapphire and diamond tiara Diana wore on her wedding day. It wasn't just a crown, it was the symbol of a young woman stepping into the jaws of monarchy, filled with dreams that would soon dissolve into disillusionment. Gifted by Queen Elizabeth herself, the tiara was meant to mark the beginning of a royal fairy tale. But what followed was far from a storybook. Instead, it became a haunting emblem of love lost, of a soul consumed by duty, and of the fracture that split a kingdom between past and present. Diana wore that crown not just for ceremonial occasions, but often as armor, boldly placing it atop her head as she walked into rooms that once humiliated her. Whether facing the scrutiny of the press or the coldness of royal corridors, the tiara shone defiantly, echoing the strength she summoned in public, even as her private world fell apart. Every sparkle of its sapphire seemed to conceal a secret, each diamond a tear unshed. It became, in time, her silent declaration. She may have lost the crown in title, but not in spirit. The people still called her their queen, and to William and Harry, she always would be. When Diana died, the tiara disappeared not just from public events, but from the memory of the institution itself. Quietly, it was locked away. Not because it had lost relevance, but because it had gained something far more dangerous: The royal family understood what that tiara symbolized. It wasn't just heritage, it was her legacy, and no one dared touch it. Until Camilla. Camilla's ascent into the monarchy had been one of calculated patience. From public enemy to Queen Consort, she had weathered storms that would have broken anyone else. But one crown remained elusive, the one she knew she could never wear without consequence. Still, over time, as titles were bestowed and trust slowly rebuilt in the public eye, Camilla's quiet ambitions surfaced. Whispers began among stylists, among court aides. She had asked about it once, perhaps twice, but nothing definitive. Until now. What Camilla underestimated, however, was the depth of William's attachment. That tiara wasn't just a relic of the past, it was sacred. He remembered how it felt to see it gleam as Diana smiled through sorrow. He remembered her bending low to kiss his forehead, the sapphires brushing against his skin. To him, it was hers, always. And worse, he remembered how it had vanished the day she did, as if both were buried by the institution they served. For Camilla to lay claim to it now wasn't just bold, it was unforgivable. Unspoken but ever-present was the promise William had made in the silence of grief. He would guard her legacy, with teeth if he had to. Yet Camilla, emboldened by power and proximity, made one fateful request that turned everything upside down. When Queen Camilla quietly approached the royal vault, she didn't expect resistance. She had walked those corridors for years, once in the shadows, now crowned in full view of the world. Her status was no longer questioned, or so she thought. The royal jewelry custodians had seen queens come and go, but few dared to make the request Camilla uttered that morning. With a measured smile and a tone dipped in practiced grace, she inquired about the tiara, the one that had not seen the light of day since Diana's passing. At first, the words sounded innocent, ceremonial even. She spoke of symbolism, of unity, of the need to present strength at the upcoming banquet. But beneath her polished delivery, there was something unspoken, a claim, a bold assertion of her place atop a monarchy still haunted by its ghosts. As her voice hardened, the air in the room shifted. What began as a polite inquiry transformed into a command. She wasn't asking. She was taking what she believed was now hers by right. But the crown she dared to reach for wasn't resting quietly in that velvet-lined box. It was a relic bound to grief, guarded not just by tradition but by the raw emotions of a son who still saw it as sacred. The staff, seasoned in discretion, stood frozen. There was hesitation, a flicker of alarm. And then, someone acted not publicly, not loudly, but with the kind of urgency that reverberates through walls lined with secrets. Within minutes, a message reached Prince William. The response was immediate. There was no need for deliberation. The words were sharp, unwavering, and final. She has no right. That sentence, reportedly delivered without hesitation, cracked the surface of royal unity in ways few had witnessed before. It wasn't simply a refusal, it was a line drawn in stone. To William, this wasn't about jewelry, it was about memory, about loyalty, about his mother, and about a woman who had already taken too much. Charles, caught between the past and the present, found himself paralyzed. The very man who once defied public opinion to stand by Camilla now stood silent. Witnesses claimed he said nothing as the fallout began to ripple through the palace. A moment that should have been routine turned into a reckoning. It was the first visible fracture that had been building quietly behind the monarchy's polished surface. For years, they had danced around the pain, pretending that the past had been forgiven, if not forgotten. But with that single request, Camilla reopened a wound that had never fully healed. The palace, always so careful to preserve the image of stability, could no longer contain the rising tension. But this wasn't just about fashion or protocol. William's decision had been simmering for years, forged in pain and silence. Years ago, in the stillness of Althorpe, at a quiet grave nestled beneath ancient trees, a boy stood frozen in grief. Prince William, barely a teenager, had just buried not only his mother but the only person in the royal family who had made him feel seen, protected, and loved without condition. It was there, amid the silence and sorrow, that he made a vow. With his brother Harry beside him and the world watching from a distance, William whispered a promise that would shape every decision he would one day make as a future king. He swore to protect Diana's legacy not just in memory, but in action. He would defend her name, guard her image, and above all, ensure that the symbols tied to her spirit were never misused or misrepresented by the very institution that had failed her. That sacred oath became the invisible force guiding him through years of royal pageantry, silent obedience, and internal conflict. Though the palace slowly moved on, shifting its attention to a new queen, William never did. He watched as Camilla transitioned from mistress to duchess, and then stunningly to Queen Consort. Each title handed to her felt like a revision of history, one that quietly erased Diana's suffering and replaced it with reconciliation. But for William, it was never reconciliation. It was a revision. A painful rewrite of a story that should have never ended the way it did. Every step Camilla took higher in rank echoed like an insult to the past. Yet William remained outwardly composed, bound by duty, protocol, and the eyes of the world. But behind that practiced smile was a storm years of holding back what he truly felt. And it wasn't just about Camilla. It was about what she represented. An institution willing to forget, to rebrand, to move on while he still carried the weight of his mother's last moments. Catherine knew this. She didn't have to ask questions or press for details. Her silence was the deepest show of loyalty. Though she had been offered countless pieces from the royal vault, she had never once asked to wear Diana's iconic tiara. Not because she didn't feel worthy, but because she understood. She, too, felt the weight of that promise William had made. Her grace in silence only strengthened his resolve. But William's loyalty was always at war with his position. He was no longer just a son. He was heir to the throne. Every decision, every reaction had implications for the monarchy. And yet, some things could not be compromised, not even for the crown. His mother's memory was one of them. So when Camilla tried to claim the tiara as her own, that buried promise came roaring back with full force. He had let the past be rewritten in whispers, but this was a line he would not allow to be crossed. And when the day of the banquet finally arrived, all the hidden tension spilled into public view in one defining act. Under the glittering chandeliers and stiff smiles, something cracked. The palace may have been dressed in grandeur, but beneath its polished marble floors and diamond-studded etiquette, a silent war was reaching its crescendo. As Queen Camilla stepped into the banquet hall, there was no mistaking the shift in energy. Dressed impeccably, adorned with regal jewels carefully chosen to distract from the absence of the one she had truly wanted, she appeared composed, but her eyes betrayed her. The sapphire and diamond tiara, the crown she believed would finally seal her acceptance, was nowhere in sight. In its place rested a substitute, beautiful, yes, but devoid of the history and power that only Diana's could command. And for Camilla, that absence was louder than any announcement. In contrast, Catherine's entrance felt almost cinematic. She moved with a quiet dignity that made the room hush. No tiara, no statement pieces, only a soft nod to the woman whose legacy she honored in silence. A small sapphire brooch, one of Diana's lesser-known pieces, sat at her shoulder, a subtle but piercing message. And then, the moment the entire evening seemed to hinge upon arrived, William's gaze. Across the expanse of noblemen, diplomats, and dignitaries, his eyes met Camilla's. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even contempt. It was colder than that. It was final. The unspoken message was clear: she had reached too far, and she had been stopped. Camilla's practiced smile, one she had perfected over decades of scrutiny and scandal, began to falter. Her hand, once steady as she greeted guests, trembled slightly. To outsiders, it may have looked like nothing. But to those who knew, to those who had witnessed the subtle language of royal power, it was a moment of collapse. She was wearing the crown, but no longer commanding the room. She had lost something far greater than a tiara. She had lost control of the narrative. The dignitaries noticed. There were puzzled glances, whispers exchanged behind raised glasses. Some had been briefed on what to expect of a queen celebrating her role beside her husband. But what they saw was a woman visibly unraveling, her presence eclipsed by the very legacy she had tried to wear. Press cameras flashed, and in those snapshots, a quiet rebellion was captured forever. This wasn't Camilla's evening. This was William's silent declaration of war and Catherine's quiet coronation by public opinion. The symbolism was brutal. The future king had drawn a line through history and marked where loyalty ends and memory begins. The monarchy, often accused of coldness, was suddenly pulsing with raw emotion. And the people watching both in the hall and around the world understood that something irreversible had just occurred. Camilla had entered that night expecting a victory lap. Instead, she found herself the center of a tragedy she could no longer control. But what unfolded after the banquet would shake the monarchy even more: Camilla's emotional spiral and Charles's painful reckoning. The palace walls have witnessed many breakdowns, but none as raw as Camilla's that night. Behind the elegance and protocol, beyond the smiling portraits and gilded corridors, something far more human unraveled. The Queen Consort, so often measured and immovable in the face of scrutiny, collapsed in the privacy of her quarters, surrounded not by courtiers and protocol, but by pain. The tiara had not been denied, it had been stripped from her hands, and the humiliation she endured was not quiet. It was public, staged, orchestrated. A calculated reminder that, no matter how far she climbed, she would never reach the one place she longed for most: acceptance. Insiders say the outburst came swiftly after the banquet ended. Doors slammed, voices were raised, staff were dismissed. And then came the sound that caught even the most seasoned guards off guard: shattering glass, crashing wood, and a scream that broke the royal silence like thunder. She had thrown her jewelry box. Its contents are necklaces, brooches, earrings, scattered like fallen soldiers across the floor. The very tools of her transformation into royalty now lay in ruin. She sobbed not only from the sting of rejection, but from the unbearable truth that it was William, not the press, not the people, who had cast the final judgment. The future king had marked the limit of her reign, and he had done it with a gaze as cold as the stones in the crown she was denied. Charles entered quietly. He had seen her rise, stood by her through decades of exile and vilification. He had made sacrifices for her, ignited scandal for her, altered royal precedent for her. But on this night, he was not a husband offering comfort. He was a king caught between love and legacy. Camilla, raw and breathless, reportedly looked at him and spat the words she had held back for far too long. "Your son humiliated me." The accusation lingered in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning beneath their marriage for years. Charles didn't deny it. He didn't soften it. Instead, his response cut deeper than any betrayal. "He's right." At that moment, the distance between them was no longer ceremonial. It was personal, emotional, permanent. Charles, bound by duty and haunted by regret, had finally chosen the memory of the woman he lost over the one he loved. And Camilla knew it. This wasn't just about William. It was about the institution itself rejecting her all over again. But now, it has done so from within. The illusion of power had crumbled, and in its place stood a truth too painful to ignore. She could hold titles, sit on thrones, and wave from balconies. But in the eyes of the heir, she would always be the outsider. And as the queen spiraled, a different energy rose elsewhere, one that pointed to a future without her at the center. She wore no diamonds that night, only grace. As the palace echoed with the fallout of Camilla's breakdown, it was Catherine who rose, not by decree or declaration, but through silence and composure. In a monarchy often ruled by spectacle and symbolism, her restraint became the loudest statement. Dressed simply, deliberately, with a delicate brooch that once belonged to Diana, Catherine didn't need a tiara to claim presence. She carried something far more commanding: dignity. And in that moment, the contrast was undeniable. As Camilla unraveled behind closed doors, Catherine stood radiant under the public gaze, steady and unshaken, the embodiment of a future that no longer waited in the wings. The press seized it immediately. Headlines praised her elegance, her stillness, her uncanny ability to say everything without speaking at all. Images of Catherine, with that faint smile and unwavering posture, flooded the media. Side by side, Camilla's forced expression and Catherine's serenity painted a picture more powerful than any royal address. Commentators whispered what the monarchy dared not say aloud: was this the real coronation? Had William staged a quiet transfer of symbolic power, not with crowns, but with choices? The absence of Diana's tiara from both women only deepened the conversation. It hadn't been passed on, it had been protected. And in doing so, William had not only honored his mother, but elevated the woman who most resembled her spirit. Within the palace, aides began noticing subtle shifts. Invitations now arrived with Catherine's name at the top. Advisors, once loyal to Camilla's court, now attended strategy meetings with the Princess of Wales. Nothing was overt. But behind the gold-trimmed walls, everyone understood what was happening. The monarchy was tilting, not with noise, but with purpose. And at the center of it stood a woman who had spent more than a decade walking a tightrope between tradition and transformation. Catherine, long celebrated for her loyalty and composure, had now become something greater. She was no longer the support. She was the symbol. William, deeply protective and increasingly authoritative, reportedly began referring to her as the new light of the monarchy. Those close to him say the phrase wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. He saw in Catherine what the public craved: stability without stiffness, elegance without elitism, modernity without rebellion. She wasn't just part of the crown, she was redefining it. And the timing was no accident. With the Queen Consort retreating from public favor and the king himself beginning to fade from the center stage, the future of the monarchy was no longer hypothetical. It was standing in plain sight. But while the public cheered, Camilla was plotting her next move, one last attempt to reclaim her image and fight back. Camilla's tears dried, but her resolve hardened. What had begun as heartbreak swiftly turned into fury. She had been publicly humiliated, not just by a cold stare across the banquet floor, but by a system that now seemed rigged against her. But if the palace thought she would retreat in silence, they were mistaken. Camilla would not go quietly, and in the days that followed, she began laying the groundwork for a counteroffensive one designed to reclaim what had been taken from her, or at the very least, to remind the monarchy that she was still a force to reckon with. But every move she made came with a price, and as the storm gathered, even she could sense that one misstep might destroy her completely. Whispers turned into statements. Leaks began appearing in the tabloids, anonymous, but unmistakable in tone. Camilla's frustrations, carefully curated and worded, started showing up in the British press. Sources close to the Queen suggested that William had overstepped, that his actions bordered on disrespect toward the monarch and the institution itself. Friends of Camilla fanned the flames further, hinting that the Prince of Wales was attempting to govern the monarchy prematurely, undermining his father in the process. These subtle attacks were meant to shift public perception, to paint Camilla not as the villain, but as the victim of a new royal power play. But the narrative didn't catch fire. Instead, it backfired. The media, already captivated by Catherine's rising role, sided with the younger generation. And the more Camilla tried to defend her position, the more she appeared out of touch, embittered, and desperate to hold on to relevance. Inside the palace, tensions soared. Private meetings between Charles and William became strained, heavy with unspoken blame and generational resentment. Camilla, though never directly present, loomed over every conversation. The king's authority, once unquestioned, now felt fragile, even to those closest to him. Charles had once held the power to protect Camilla from any backlash, but now he was visibly retreating, allowing William's influence to grow unchecked. Courtiers began reading between the lines. If the monarch was no longer in control of his own household, then who truly held the reins? Then came the final insult. At a formal engagement just days after the banquet, Camilla attempted to wear a brooch from Diana's former collection, an elegant but historically significant piece rarely seen since the late princess's passing. Within hours, a message was delivered discreetly through protocol channels. It was not appropriate. The piece was deemed off-limits. To Camilla, this was no longer about jewelry. It was a campaign of containment. She was being systematically erased from the royal narrative, stripped not only of symbolic power, but of emotional legitimacy. Behind closed doors, whispers began to circulate among palace aides and loyalists. Some openly questioned whether Camilla's role as queen had become purely ceremonial, maintained for appearance, but hollowed out from within. And then, at the peak of the crisis, an unexpected letter arrived, sealed with a crest long buried, one that would end the argument for good. A sealed envelope from a mother long gone, hidden for decades in a private archive tucked away from the public eye. It resurfaced at the moment the monarchy stood most divided. Among Diana's carefully preserved personal effects, letters, photographs, and keepsakes, was one piece no one outside the immediate family had ever read. A note, handwritten by the Princess of Wales, addressed to her eldest son. It was quiet in its simplicity but thunderous in its intent. It wasn't just a message, it was a decree, one that echoed louder than any proclamation from a throne, and when it was finally read aloud, it brought the palace to its knees. William opened the letter in front of his father, eyes scanning the familiar curves of his mother's pen. Every word struck a chord buried deep within him. And then came the line that would change everything. Protect what's sacred, and never let anyone wear my crown unless they've earned it. There was no need for interpretation, the message was crystal clear. Diana had known even then that legacy wasn't about blood or titles, it was about truth, about character, about worthiness. Her tiara, like her memory, wasn't meant to be worn, it was meant to be guarded. And William, who had spent a lifetime navigating between silence and service, suddenly had the final piece of clarity he'd been searching for. Charles said nothing at first. For a long moment, he simply stared at the letter in his son's hands. Then, slowly, he nodded once. It was not an agreement. It was a resignation. A quiet acknowledgement that the woman the institution had once tried to silence now spoke louder than ever. There was no protocol to follow, no precedent to cite. There was only a choice. And William had already made his. When the letter was shown to Camilla, it shattered the last vestiges of her strength. Witnesses say she broke down, this time not in rage or resistance, but in pure devastation. The note confirmed what she had feared all along, that Diana's presence still loomed large, too powerful to challenge. Camilla had won titles, walked red carpets, stood beside the king himself, but she had never truly taken the people's crown. And now, with Diana's final words laid bare, she knew she never would. A final decision was made quietly, but firmly. Diana's tiara would remain in the royal vault, untouched unless worn by Catherine or, in time, Princess Charlotte. It was no longer just jewelry. It was a sacred relic, protected by the memory of a woman who had been broken by the monarchy, yet had come to define it. And so, the shift was complete. Not through scandal or ceremony, but through truth delivered from beyond the grave. The monarchy, once fractured by silence and shadow, began to find its balance not by rewriting the past, but by honoring it. The institution that had once cast Diana aside now bowed, finally, to her enduring legacy. And so, with tears shed and truths laid bare, the crown found its true path not through inheritance, but through earned honor, love, and loyalty. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.